chapters of the plan or complex topic areas, those are best done as separate plan change processes rather than rolled all up into single, very large plan changes. So the first of those plan changes would be the omnibus plan change. So as it stands, these recommendations note the content for the inclusion and that decision point that will be coming back after the second tranche. What we'll be the reason for coming back after the second tranche is A, resourcing, and B, we will want to take any matters that have come out of the second tranche into it. And it also notes that discrete technical criteria. Now, attached to the paper, or within the paper, you'll see a series of out-of-scope matters. Now, when I briefed you earlier, before the first tranche of district plan decisions, I outlined this omnibus plan change and the small matters it deals with. Within those recommendations are some larger, more technical matters. The reason they have been brought to your attention is if you wish to include them within the omnibus. If you wish to do so, then you must raise an amendment to do so. The reason why we would not simply roll these make a very, very large plan change is because when we are recommending the appointment of commissioners to you, we are generally looking to tailor those commissioners' skill bases to the type of plan change they are considering. So, for example, if they're considering heritage listings, you need to have commissioners with heritage expertise. The other reason for doing it is it makes submissions harder for the public when you're dealing with multiple different types of issues. It's generally easier for people to submit on a topic area or a chapter rather than to pepper pot a whole series of disparate rules. Now, bear in mind, have any of you ever seen the statutes amendment bills that go through Parliament? They fix all the little mistakes in legislation. That's what an omnibus plan change generally looks like. So then we come to the matters that were raised by councillors and passed by the committee back in March. So the first of these is the rezoning of the Brooklyn Community Centre land. So this recommendation would direct us, your officers, to include the rezoning of the Brooklyn Community Centre from medium density residential zone back to the open space zone as part of the upcoming omnibus plan change process. We have engaged with the Brooklyn community the community association that run the community centre. We've been through what this would mean for them. They have made this choice of zone, and so we are recommending it to you. This is the community centre. It is the parcel of land that is outlined with the dotted lines, and there is no plan to intensify that site with housing. We don't see that this would have a particularly large impact, and so we would recommend supporting the community centre's committee's desire. The noise from music venues. Now, this is an area I know that is of particular interest to a number of councillors. So the first recommendation is to note that there are limited opportunities to resolve reverse sensitivity risks from music venues. So reverse sensitivity is where you have a use and you bring the problem to it. So the classic one that we use to teach young planners is you have a factory with an outlet to a stream and you decide to build a swimming pool directly downstream of that outlet in the stream. You've brought swimmers to the contamination, and that has created a human health problem. So, in terms of music venues, the difficulty with altering the district plan to increase noise levels is there is sorry, whispering. The difficulty with increasing noise levels is essentially there are reasonably high noise levels within the central city as it stands. If we increase those noise thresholds, then the requirements for insulation to mitigate that noise for apartments will increase, which will increase the cost of building housing, and it will also mean that there will need to be some thought given to retrofitting existing buildings that have been built to the noise standards. This also creates a difficulty in satisfying the demands that the RMA places on us to meet the reasonable test. And so, as it's outlined in the paper, that means that moving that noise limit comes with a whole series of barriers. We will be replying to this in the written Q&A that you're receiving tonight. So what we'll do is have that written out with and stepped out with the different thresholds and advice from both my planners and also the enforcement team. The next one directs officers to consider any clarification or minor alterations to district plan to enable music venues to operate. So what are we looking at there, Michael?
So there's a series of non-regulatory methods that have been recommended. They're mainly sort of information pieces for people looking to perhaps relocate to the CBD for inner city living, sort of alert type information that might come through a LIM process. Basically just try to give people information to help understand decisions they might make. I think there's an expectation that people moving into noisy environments would expect that they're moving into noisy environments, but that doesn't often play out in reality. So just drawing people's attention to that, and that would go in hand with some of the insulation requirements that have already existed within the district plan since 2000 district plan. So it's a little bit of a belts and braces type approach, but something that could add some additional value to, I guess, regulatory protections that already exist.
Okay. Oh, I've got the clicker. You're the chair.
I'm the only one who's allowed to ask questions as we go. What I'm curious about with this particular thing is whether there's any change to the current sort of status quo. I mean, for instance, if you've got a not a Frank Kids Park, if you've got a Waitangi Park, where obviously there are lots of concerts and presumably that's allowed, and you've got venues like San Fran or Meow or whatever, and they make a lot of noise, is there going to be any change to the way those venues operate now under what is planned? Or are we, sort of expanding their capacity to make noise or shrinking their capacity to make noise, or is it just an attempt to maintain the status quo?
As Sean was mentioning, there's an RMA test around avoiding unreasonable exposure to noise. So how it tends to play out in reality is that we have regulatory controls to protect, say, residential developments within the city centre. So they're insulated from the noise, normally mechanical ventilation to protect them from unreasonable exposure. We also have some permissibility around what is considered reasonable, and that becomes part of the mix for venues if they require a consent. If they exceed that, and it is something that happens from time to time, the compliance team will go out, they will measure noise, they will talk to venues as they're operating, and usually what happens is, they'll have a conversation. No, there are insulation requirements. Hayden has prepared some advice on this. Hayden, has there been any change in the decibel requirements from the 24 district plan?
No, there hasn't been any change. So the insulation requirements and the noise levels are consistent between the 2000 and the 2024 district plan.
I'm conscious in the district plan, one of the things was about extending the certain amount of the sound bucket, say, for example, along Courtney Place. If we wanted to, we kind of looked at zoning a different part of the city so that perhaps they would be able to go up to a higher level of noise. What would that look like under this advice? Or because we looked at a few different ways of doing it.
Yeah, so the Courtney Place noise area just increases the insulation requirement in that area. So it's 30 dB insulation around the central city generally, and then within the Courtney Place area, and also there's a setback from State Highway 1, which also has a 35 dB insulation. So that's the only difference between that area and the rest of the city. So the upper noise limit is still the same. It just kind of recognises that it's like generally like a higher background noise area. So, yeah.
And like, say, understanding the implication for homes to be built with insulation requirements, would it be possible to allow a venue? Is there any way that we could transfer that requirement to the venue to insulate their venue better instead of onto residential properties if we can assure that maybe there's less than 30 dB?
Yeah, so at present, the district plan doesn't put any insulation requirements on music venues. So that's something we'd need to investigate further about what's appropriate for music venues. But at present, they are a permitted activity in the city centre, but they don't have any, the onus is on the residential properties, I guess is a good way to frame it.
Oh, righto. Okay, thanks.
And just to further to that, if they could potentially play louder and they would still have to manage the effects at the boundary where it would meet a residential activity. So it would be in their control to maybe insulate their own premises to allow them to exceed what would otherwise occur at that boundary edge.
I did speak to the noise officers about this, and one of the difficulties with the approach of the venue being insulated is most of the a number of the call-outs they have been because the venues have left doors open or essentially holes in the envelope that have allowed the sound out, and so it becomes a difficulty in that would have to find some way of assuring that the venue was operated in a way that kept the noise in as well.
So just on that, are the decibel levels the same as the national central city across New Zealand, or are they varying through different cities?
So you're asking, are they the same as the central cities in Auckland and Christchurch?
Yes.
I believe they're the same, or if not similar. So they're derived from some national guidance on what's appropriate for city centre living. So they generally derive themselves from that. I can't recall the name of that standard off the top of my head, but
Okay, and I guess, and I have put this in the Q&A, but observing how this happens, it is a security guard that comes out and talks to the owner and says, I think your noise is too loud. And they have a big debate with the business owner about if it is too loud or not. And there is no actual measuring that I could see take place. So what is the process? Is there a way to actually measure it? I guess what I see from a business point of view is how do you operate when it's a subjective, is it loud or not?
Okay, so I have the written answer.
Thank you.
Which are essentially, if we receive a noise complaint on the night, in the night, Council has a statutory obligation to investigate pursuant to Section 326 of the RMA. This is a subjective analysis only. For ongoing issues, we will arrange sound measurements. These are taken from the complainant's property. We have sophisticated sound level meters that can cut out extraneous noise either in the field or back in the office through software. The resultant noise level representing venue noise only is then compared to the district plan noise limit. If non-compliant, the venue is contacted and given adequate time to comply.
Basically, we try and work with them to fix it before we start going down an enforcement pathway where you'd actually bring out, and the noise officers who go out are very highly trained. So just from how far away they can hear it from gives them an idea of what kind of level of compliance they're dealing with. We have a lot of things where people have extended into outdoor dining areas, and we've given them liquor licences for that, in which case they have to come up with their own noise management plan. But as it was said earlier, often it's the fact they leave the doors open when they're meant to have the doors closed, because the outdoor dining people want to hear the music. So usually it's just a matter of getting in there and making sure that all those things are compliant, but not being too heavy-handed to start off with. But we can go out and do those measurements if we need to, but we prefer to work with the venue operators.
It seems a bit vague to me to actually use a subjective level of noise, but when it's so easy to actually measure a decibel level. So why do we actually do that? And does anyone else do that?
So we do use a decibel level, and that's what those sound meters are measuring.
Yeah, just so Ray's asking, so Ray, what we do is we go and we have a gentle chat to them before we then come back if they repeat the problem and we start to measure them. So, yeah.
Can you tell me?
We don't have a large number of noise complaints. Generally, when we go out and talk to a venue operator, they're more than happy to work with us. So it's not a major issue from a resource consent compliance perspective.
Mm-hmm. Can you tell me what the decibel level is for being significant? Would it be over 85 decibels?
The noise level in the district plan, I think, is 60 dB, the upper one. But the excessive noise complaints that are assessed on the night that we're talking about now, again, like it's a subjective assessment, so it's not necessarily like they don't have a defined decibel level. You'd have to talk to the noise compliance officers, I think, if they have anything internal. But as far as like from what I've talked to them, they don't have like a noise level that they work to. It's just subjective with a few factors considered.
Okay, great, thank you.
Thank you. In terms of the measurement device, is it possible for the venue operator or even resident to be able to separately use an appropriate device to measure the noise such that they're not reliant on the specialist officers turning up at the right time at the right place?
I would have to speak with our enforcement officers to get an answer to that particular question. Sometimes, anybody can buy an audiometer, but often the ability to use them in evidence or for enforcement has some regulation around them. So I'll need to seek some specialist advice.
Yes, I'm not saying that. I'm just wondering that, when people are trying to proactively work out whether or not they are breaching noise regulations, either from a residential perspective or from a venue perspective, our ability to provide them assistance for them to be able to get some measure, not necessarily for evidence, but to say how close they are perhaps to what is the real limit. Is just wondering if officers could bring some advice perhaps to the meeting. Not necessarily answer it straight away, but I'm just want to empower people to be able to do the right thing.
Excellent, thank you.
Yeah, let's crack on, Sean, and perhaps, yeah, that's right, and we'll pause for questions when you think it's appropriate, perhaps at the end.
Very good. Yes, my Chief Planning Officer. The next matter that's dealt with is noise from broadcasted calls to prayer. So this notes that Michael and I have been out to the Kilburnie Mosque and discussed matters, and the request has been clarified to calls to prayer for 3 times a year as outlined there. We have then worked with our consenting and enforcement colleagues to come to a conclusion that these can be permitted under the temporary activity rules, and we will be writing to the mosque to give them clarity over that. The next matter is the Te Ao Māori plan change. So this is in response to an amendment that passed back in March, and that was on the back of feedback from both our mana whenua partners and from commissioners that there were matters that were unresolved during the district plan process, largely because either parties had learned and decided that they wished to pursue other things, or there were some matters such as more upoko's involvement within the district plan that couldn't be concluded by the commissioners. What is happening with this is our officers are meeting with the mana whenua and Māori authorities that have raised interest and are working through what the process for a plan change might be and clarifying what the scope of it would be. That then gets us to the 2 recommendations, one noting that that process has commenced, and the second that we will report back with a scope early in 2025. Then we come to the matter of route protection for mass rapid transit. Now there are quite a number of recommendations attached to this in response to amendments that passed in March. So the first notes that a notice of requirement for a full designation of the route at the moment is not presently feasible. Now, the reason for this is because there is a burden of evidence that's required to make a notice of requirement. A notice of requirement is essentially an outline plan that goes into the district plan and a set of provisions that's used to protect a route. So, for example, before Transmission Gully was built, a designation was put in place to make sure that nobody built in the way of the new motorway. The second set of recommendations directs officers to investigate ways to protect space for future mass rapid transit construction from the Basin Reserve to Newtown School. Now, the reason why we have done that, we have recommended that, is because that part was part of all route options that were considered, and because that is the area with which we have the most information. We're recommending that you were to, if you choose to do so, that you include that in the scope of the Wellington City Transport Plan, which is a set of papers that will come back to you at the end of the month. The recommendations there are reasonably extensive, so I won't read them all to you, but one of the more important ones is A, which is a recommendation to consider reinstating a notice of requirement to widen parts of Adelaide Road and Ridderford Street between Rugby Street and Mean Street. That designation would look like this. The hospital side of the road is on the bottom of that map. The designation area is the thick black line. So what it is looking to do is to widen the side of the road, the hospital side of the road, essentially all the way down from the basin to the start of Newtown, Mine Street. A notice of requirement application and how it becomes a designation would have the effect of stopping property owners from doing any development that would prevent or impede a project or related public work being built. So what you are looking at is essentially stopping people from building in the way of what you want to do in that area. If a property owner was to apply for consent, they would need permission from the council first. So property owners under the designation can ask the council to buy their land. And if not agreed voluntarily, they can apply for the Environment Court for an order for the council to buy it or leave all or part of the land. So you could, because this is a designation for road widening, you could just buy the piece of land you're interested in, not the entire parcel. The other important point is designations are considered in order. So when they overlap, the oldest designation takes precedence. Basically, it's sort of calling dibs in the planning system. The final two recommendations on this particular matter note that any notice of requirement within the John Street intersection would affect the heritage area, and instructs officers to include support of a designation process that allows for route protection separate from infrastructure construction in the drafts of submissions made on the upcoming phase 3 of resource management reform. What that would do is take a position that you could protect infrastructure without acquiring the land. So whereas before, I've advised you under the current system that if you were to put a designation in, you would have to potentially purchase that land. This set of submissions under the forthcoming law changes would remove that requirement, and so you could simply effectively sterilise that land. That would be a return to a previous regime from before the Resource Management Act. Sorry, sterilise is a planning term. Sterilisation means... It's not family planning, Councillor Young. Sterilisation is where you prevent the use of land. So, no, it's not demolishing. It just means you simply can't do anything with it.
All right, let's move on. I'm going to ask my chief advisor to sit in this chair. I have to go to 2 o'clock, so I apologise, councillors. Is that okay, Moana? Thank you very much.
Let's move on to spatial planning. That's much safer. So there are two recommendations for spatial planning. My apologies, the number's gone a bit wonky as I put it into the template. But one notes the passage of the district plan and the need to revisit the spatial plan, and then the second looks to program a workshop with you to scope the parameters of that update and to report back on the action plan for the 2021 spatial plan. Questions?
So I'd like to give way to Councillor.
Get my name down.
So I just note that Councillor McNulty was clearly ahead of me. So if you just with your forbearance, could you give the first question to Councillor McNulty?
Hey, thank you, Sean. I just want to go back to get some unequivocal clarification around the call to prayer. So a group recently wanted to use this to create hysteria around what was included in the call to prayer. Their representation was that the city's 6 mosques would be broadcasting call to prayer across the city. So from what is in this plan, can you just unequivocally rule out that that's actually essentially a lie or misrepresentation?
I have never received a request for 7 mosques in Wellington to give daily calls to prayer. The only requests that we have received are up there. The only reason there was any question of what was required was because we needed to speak with the relevant authorities at the mosque to understand what their ask was before we could provide you advice.
Thank you. And if any future changes were needed, we'd go through the same process yet again if any other religious institutions, whoever they would be, wanted to have noise exemptions, they would need to come through and do the exact same process.
Yes, we answer dozens of planning questions each day. This one was slightly unusual in that it was asked during a plan review process, but no amendment to the district plan can be taken without a democratic decision.
Thank you.
So just with respect to the call to prayer, what is the decibel limit or whatever it is that applies without any consent in this situation?
Michael will just look it up for you.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry, Mr. Patterson has informed me that it's 75 decibels.
Okay, thank you. So with respect to the notice of requirement, MRT, so I've asked some other questions, but a couple of key ones. For how long has the current notice of requirement been in place such that property owners have not been able to, well,
so the current notice of there is no current notice of requirement. There is a previous notice of requirement. Oh. So what this would look to do is to reinstate that.
Okay, so when was the previous notice of requirement? What period did that cover?
Andrew, do you know when the previous notice of requirement lapsed?
The 2000 district plan didn't include it.
It lapsed during the 2000 district plan.
Okay. And secondly, is there any funding in the long-term plan to acquire this land?
No, there's no money.
No, there is no money.
So we're going to put dibs on this land that we want to acquire it, but we've got no funding for acquiring it in the long-term plan.
If you were to decide to put dibs on the land, then you would need to find the money. That's what the advice is saying.
Okay, so does that mean that should a property owner wish to have the council acquire the property, that the council would need to find that money?
Only if you were to put a notice of requirement over the land.
Okay, we'll move on to Councillor Matthews.
So I have two, and the first one is, so the matters of heritage and the view shafts issues which have been highlighted in the paper, if we do not amend the paper, what happens?
If you do not amend the paper, then those matters will go into, essentially remain with officers. We will look at them when we next go to do a plan change, but it would effectively come down to my professional advice as to whether they proceeded or not.
And some of the items mentioned for potential heritage include the City to Sea Bridge and the Tinako area. What would happen to our work and plans in these areas if we were to begin a process at looking at heritage protection?
So it would seem rather an unusual decision for you to take to preserve something you were meaning to change, which would increase the transactive cost of doing that work. So if you were to choose to reintroduce these matters, you would necessarily have to face advice about how that would be a good use of ratepayers' funds.
And sorry, finally, so have you liaised with the team who are working on these areas, and have they provided any advice about what the consequences of such a move by us would be?
I have spoken with the project team for Tinako. We have not considered, we haven't got advice for you, other than to say it would be an extremely unusual move if you were to propose it.
Thank you. So just in terms of the John Street shops, you're basically saying that you could put the designation on but retain them, or would they have to be moved?
So that's one of those issues that would need to be worked through. So the designation would cover those shops, and then you would need to work out a way of preserving that heritage value. It's probably, given you're considering building line infrastructure under such a designation, it would suggest you would have to move them.
Okay, now I was just a bit unclear from the recommendations around the light rail, what actually this all means. It just feels like it's quite vague. So you're saying it would go into the transport strategy. If it goes into the transport strategy, do we then have to make another decision? Do we have to put a budget bit in to do the designation work?
So the elephant in the room is that you don't have a light rail scheme that you have committed to building. You have a preferred mode decision that remains from Let's Get Wellington moving, but we don't have the certainty necessary for a designation to take place for light rail, in my opinion, and that's why
need a decision from government. You mean?
We would need to see a pathway that gave reasonable certainty that investment was going to take place.
Okay, so you can't just kind of go, okay, we're going to do this in stage. So we'll get the designation, which of course is what NZTA does with motorways. Then hopefully in a few more years, then we can actually get the money to pay for it.
So what you see with the NZTA is, A, there tend to be rolling over previous designations that were made under previous legislative frameworks, and B, they tend to be able to point to long-term investment plans like they did with Transmission Gully. The difficulty we have at the moment is that investment pathway is not particularly clear to us, and the tests for imposing this kind of limit to property rights are reasonably high. So that's why we've given the advice that it's not feasible at the moment.
Can I just, one last question. as you are very, very familiar with, what happens is you do a big plan change and then you have to keep doing plan changes because things don't stay still. So are you expecting that we'll end up with another 80 plan changes before we then do another big review? And how are we going to manage the cost and the workload?
So that's one of the reasons why I am bringing these papers to you, is to help understand, to help work out what that workload should be like and what your appetite for cost and effort is. In terms of the overall number of plan changes that are going to be required to the 2024 plan, I'm not certain. I don't even know how long it will last, given legislative reform. However, it is the nature of the planning system that because it is connected to a living, breathing city, it must live and breathe too and adapt to it. And we will need to do at least, we'll need to be doing probably a couple of plan changes every couple of years just to stay up to date, I would think.
Yeah.
Could I ask the chair whether he was keeping a list of people's names as I put my hand up about half an hour ago? Just moving on from that. So first of all, so with the... Your first question. That was... Two more. So the next one is, so I found the clarification about the broadcasting of prayers helpful. It would have been helpful if that had been clear from the beginning. But can you just tell me how long will the broadcast last? Like, will it be like a Requiem Mass? To use something you're familiar with?
Having been to a number of Requiem Masses, I can assure you that this will not last quite that long. We were privileged to be at the mosque for a call to prayer, and it lasted between 1.5 minutes and 2.5 minutes. They're not particularly long.
No, that's not long. So second question, which is, thank you, totally different. So just thinking about the notices of requirement, has there been a notice of requirement for the properties on Patterson Street, or doesn't it count because they're already owned by NZTA?
So,
Boyer Tunnel.
You're rather testing my memory there, but those properties have been acquired under the Public Works Act from memory, and there was a notice of requirement. There was a notice of requirement protecting the state highway and the new tunnel. Whether the notice of requirement was used to acquire those properties, I'm not quite sure.
That's probably before the notice. It would have been done in the 60s.
The notices of requirement designations are the last part of the Town and Country Planning Act that exists, so they could have been done under that. But
interesting. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, just on some of my favourite structures in the city, Gordon Wilson, Carn House, Rusty Oil Tank, et al., if we were looking to get through the changes that we tried to do at the first time, is there anything coming up in this to progress that, or is it better to wait on the signalled reform that the Minister has said he will be looking at in phase 2 of the RMA?
You have exhausted the options available for Gordon Wilson under the current law. You're best to wait for new law if that is what you look to achieve.
Yes.
Just back to the noise controls. So at the beginning you mentioned... Muted. Is there a way we could have more of a variance or more permissiveness for bar owners or event holders, whereby we have a different way? I guess the question is broadly, could we do more work to understand some more solutions? And some of those outcomes could be things like having Friday and Saturday nights where you can put the music up louder, or things like you could apply for a licence to have an event outside so that we know that there's going to be noise between X and X.
So in terms of an event outside, we normally deal with those during the resource consenting process. So they normally come under the temporary activity rules of the plan, and so that's how a concert in Waitangi Park would be consented. The question of variable noise limits for, say, a Friday or Saturday night, have we considered those?
The issue that I kind of ran into with that idea is that the noise complaints that they're often subject to are separate from the district plan noise limits. So as we mentioned before, they're a subjective assessment from a noise professional. So like you could put up noise limits, but it wouldn't necessarily mean those excessive complaints would go away. So if an excessive complaint is happening under the current noise limits, it would likely happen under higher noise limits as well. And part of the issue as well is that a lot of the bars are in already built up areas, so district plan struggles to apply retroactively, so it wouldn't be until they get a new consent they have to apply any of the new regulations that we put in, so that would, the existing properties would also be an issue as well.
One of the significant challenges that would be faced with that option is that the council still has a duty to avoid unreasonable exposure to noise. So you could create a more permissive environment, but once it reaches that threshold, the council's duty bound to act on that and take a compliance approach, and whether that would be kind of conducive to, I guess, the vibrancy outcomes that the council might want for the central city would be something that would have to be seriously considered. So there's a real tension there between having a permissive and enabling environment for venues, but also protecting people's reasonable expectations around the amenity that they can expect where they live. So yeah, the district plans tried to manage that tension, which is why there's the noise standards and why there are sort of higher noise emissions that are permitted under the district plan.
Is there a way we could differentiate music and noise?
I'm not sure you could.
Yeah, so it's I don't know if trees falling in the woods make a noise either. The difficulty is, so the district plan is more, in truth, measuring sound, and doesn't really differentiate between it doesn't really differentiate the purpose behind that sound. So I'm not sure we'll be able to define our way out of the problem.
Councillor Chung.
Great, thanks. Regarding the notice of requirement, you're talking about the streets in Newtown. Now, the proposal is to run this mass transit from the railway station through to Island Bay. So where would the route be along from the railway station now? Would it be along the quays, in which case it may conflict with the second spine? Or would it run through the city, where you're going to be putting notice of requirements to half the CBD?
So that is precisely why we have referred the process into the transport plan, because we need to understand the decisions that would need to be made. The notices of requirement are just tools, they're not purposes. So we would need to understand what is the council's long-term desire for mass rapid transit along this corridor, and what tools are best deployed to protect that route.
Okay, I see. And what about houses, or properties that are already designated as historic places along the route? Now, this may not necessarily just be in Newtown, but it could be anywhere along that possible route. What's the mechanism for delisting those if we needed to, or if we needed to put a notice of requirement on there? Because wouldn't that be difficult to actually do that with a historic registered house or designated house?
So, yes, the question of how would you delist a heritage building is a very vexed one, and I can point to your recent experiences with Gordon Wilson as an example of that. What would happen is, if you were to put a notice of requirement over a route and you encountered a heritage building, say, that would become a Section 6 matter. So Section 6 of the RMA outlines matters of national importance. That means that you would then have to figure out a way of effectively mitigating it. And so that's where Councillor Pannett's earlier questions around what happens at John Street come in.
Great, thank you. Now, on to the call to prayer. You mentioned to my colleague, Councillor Randall, that the maximum decibel rating was 75 dB. So where would that be measured from? Would that be measured from the boundary, or would we be looking at the zone, similar to the airport zone where noise can actually reach, or do we measure at where that 75 dB actually reaches to?
Yeah, so that was covered in the paper. It's generally at the boundary of the receiving property that's measured from, which in this case would be in the metropolitan zone, the metropolitan centre zone in Kilburnie.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing to bear in mind is that the daytime noise limits are higher than the nighttime ones we've been discussing earlier.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And the second part to that is that because this is likely to be an issue of great interest to residents within that area, whether it be Kilburnie or I'm not sure how far the noise would actually reach to, but it's going to require considerable consultation. So would a referendum be considered for that?
Absolutely not. It's a permitted activity in the district plan. There is no need for any decision by the council. That's why it is a noting recommendation.
Okay, thanks.
Councillor O'Neill.
Kia ora, thank you. I just wanted to ask about the ability to look at identifying music venues within the district plan and potentially changing, like within the scope of putting this up for an amendment into the omnibus, that council could increase the CCZ zone to specific areas. And I'm thinking like Meow-Noe, Valhalla, the old laundry spot. And I was just wondering if, I'm still trying to, apologies, understand the paper's scope for amendment.
Okay, so the question you're asking me is, could we identify where a music venue was and then apply a noise buffer around it?
Yeah, or the outcome I'm trying to seek is a more permissive ability for music venues, entertainment, community-based venues, rather than hospitality-focused venues or other things, to kind of allow a greater scope on Friday, Saturday nights, or just in specific targeted areas.
Right, I'll have the team see if we can find a formula of words for you. The trouble we'll have to think our way through is how permanent mitigation measures around venues, given that they do change over time, and B, how would we detect and define venues?
Yeah, absolutely. I wondered if, in terms of detecting and defining, I know it's not a planning tool, but through our liquor licensing structures, we ask venues to categorise between performance community art spaces or hospitality spaces, and maybe if we focused on that first group, we could get a greater outcome for live music rather than organisations focused on just selling lots of alcohol, and that might also depend on making an assumption.
It's quite normal to use definitions from other statutes within district plans, so there's probably something in that line that can be done.
I would say just on that when we're assessing options for mapping music venues, we were sort of focusing on existing ones, because if you had a definition for music venues, for example, then a new one could pop up and it would just make a bit of uncertainty with the district plan. So we'd probably focus on the existing ones so you could map it out and say hey, here they are, if there was any option that required mapping.
Last question is Councillor Randalls. Sorry. Bill.
The question from Councillor Wineta online as well, Chair.
Yes, so I have a few, but hopefully the Chair's indulgence. So, while noise, officers mentioned that if we increase the noise level, there'll be a cost increase in terms of required insulation. Is there any able to provide any information about what that cost increase would be? What are we talking about? Are we talking about a few $100s, a few $1,000, $10,000, $20,000?
I don't have any specific numbers, but I was chatting to the noise compliance officers who often do the work to do the consents for people that get this installation requirement, and they described it as significant, but we could probably go back to them and get some more definite numbers around that.
Yeah, that would be very helpful, because if we're going to impose costs on future building, we need to know what they are. Secondly, you said that there's also minor modification in terms of LIM updates. Can you just describe a little bit more about what a LIM on a residential property that would be very close to, say, Courtney Place, how that we modify to take, to flag the noise issue?
It was basically just an idea to, if someone gets a LIM for a property, that is close to a music venue, to notify it on the LIM, but we hadn't heard back from the LIM team at the time of the report, so we don't have information on whether that's possible or not.
In terms of the mechanics of how that could work, is we would spatially define where those are located, and you'd have a buffer zone of sorts, and then if you had a LIM and you fell within that, then you would get a piece of advice advising that there was a particular venue that might produce noise that's noisy,
on a regular
and to
basis.
be aware of that. Yes.
Yeah, and so I just want to understand how that would affect the interpretation of noise, excessive noise, in terms of saying, well, you bought into it, we're going to give the venue a little more leeway compared to the rest of the city.
I think the same. The status quo would still remain. There would still be the tests in terms of the decibel readings if an enforcement approach was taken, and then the test still remains in the RMA to avoid unreasonable exposure to noise. So, whether that was in the LIM or not, those things would still exist.
Okay. Third question. Switching to the spatial plan, I just wanted to see if you could explain why are we starting this now, and what will it cost? Why not wait till, for example, the completion of the whole district plan? Is there any compelling reason why it's starting now?
So the main reason to start relatively early is because we have the major land use decisions for the district plan about where density can go under the regulatory system. What we need to do now is to work our way through the reconciliation of all of the different infrastructure investment classes and essentially make sure that is mapped spatially and by community and by dependency, so that advice is in good time for the infrastructure strategy and the next long-term plan. And the reason for that is to make sure that the investment plans for each infrastructure class speak to each other. In very simple terms, it means making sure that water pipes are cognizant of road and transport investment phasing on top.
Okay. I've got two more, but I'll go if I can.
Just really quickly, I've got 3 questions. Is there a way we can help by giving the technology and training to bar owners to help them understand their own noise levels? I know you kind of answered that before.
I'll speak to the enforcers, and we should be able to have an answer to you before the day.
Is there a definition of excessive?
The district plan gives a proxy with the maximum decibel level, but there is, as was mentioned, an interpretation that goes with that. I don't think it's defined in statute what excessive is. It's just an obligation on council to put enforcement in place to avoid unreasonable.
Okay.
Sorry, that's it. Sorry, we've run out of time. So we've got Nico's allowed the very last question. It's your turn, Nico, if you've got a question you'd like to ask.
Last question. Can we push those noise limits to apply later in the evening? For example, could we be more permissive up to a certain time and then tighten the limits? Could a band play until midnight, for example, on a Saturday night?
This just goes back to the earlier answer I gave. We could, but there's still a duty for the council to ensure that people aren't exposed to an unreasonable level of noise. So we could put it up to 1,000 decibels, but we would still have to make sure that people aren't unreasonably exposed.
Thank you very much. That's the end of the meeting. If anyone's got any further questions, feel free to follow up at their own time. Thank you.
Oh, can we have a slide? Can we have the slides sent through, please?
Yes, we'll send through the slides and they'll go through the democratic services.
Thank you.
Yeah, we can have those on diligent, and just a reminder that the Q&As are being sent out tomorrow. This evening, you'll get the regs ones tonight. Thank you.